Alright, so I'm Jacob Russell. This is my presentation, Jordan Schoolboys. So I'll start off with a little video clip for you all. If it works.
And I say to you, gentlemen, that this college is a failure. The trouble is we're neglecting football for education.
Exactly. The professor is right.
Well, I'm right, am I?
Well, I'm not right, I'm wrong. I just said that to test you. Now I know where I'm at. I'm dealing with a couple of snakes.
What I meant to say was that there's too much football and not enough education.
That's what I think.
Oh, you do you? Well, you're wrong again.
If there was a snake here, I'd apologize. Where would this college be without football? Have we got a stadium? Yes. Have we got a college? Yes. Well, we can't support both. Tomorrow we start tearing down the college.
But Professor,
Where will the students sleep?
Well, they always sleep in the classroom.
So this clip is from the Marx Brothers' 1932 Horse Feathers. In this film, Groucho Marx portrays a university president who's trying to save his college. And what's his solution? Solution is to have a successful football team. And now what does he do to get a successful football team? He recruits players and he pays them. So it sounds kind of familiar to today. But that all being said, the Marx Brothers address a really important question here, which is, what is this odd marriage between education and football? Well, to answer that question, we don't have to look that far. Look right here at Stanford University. So Stanford was founded, its doors opened on October 1st, 1891. And within a week, University of California at Berkeley challenged Stanford to a football game. So the foundation of Stanford and its football team are inherently intertwined. Now, this is reflective of a broader phenomenon that was happening during the turn of the century. There were many cultural trends that were occurring, namely rise in Darwinian thought, industrialization, and this crisis of manhood. So in this thesis, I'm going to use Stanford as a case study for the rise of college football in the 19th century. So in this thesis, what I'm going to look at is first I'll look at the historical context. So I'll look at the rise in Darwinian thought, and then the industrial era as well, leading to this competitive society, and then how that all kind of culminated in a crisis of manhood. And then we'll move on to Stanford. So Stanford's founding, and then its football team, the rise of its football team, the fall of its football team, which we'll get to, and then its renaissance. And down below, you can kind of see a little timeline to see where all that occurs. So we have Darwin's Origin of Species, end of the Civil War, which was a major turning point, first intercollegiate football game, founding of Stanford, the first Stanford football game, its fall, and then its rise once again. So, start off with a little bit of the Darwinian thought at the time. So as I mentioned, Darwin published The Origin of Species in 1859, and this changed the worldview of not only biology studies, but also the way that people viewed the world. Suddenly, struggle and competition started to become commonplace in the mindset of many people in science and also in other disciplines. So the study of finches and the study of plants suddenly became the study of human beings, which his cousin, Francis Galton, namely did with eugenics. So he started applying Darwin's theories from animals and plants to human beings through eugenics, looking at the ways by which the superior individuals needed to breed and the inferior individuals could not breed. So we had application of Darwin from the animals to man, and then you had the application of Darwin towards society, and that's Herbert Spencer below. So Darwin didn't actually coin the term survival of the fittest. That was actually Herbert Spencer. And Herbert Spencer was the father of sociology. So he applied a lot of this Darwin belief in society. At the same time, he used Darwin's beliefs to justify a lot of the cultural trends that were happening and economic trends, different inequalities that are happening in society. Lastly, he also commented on sports and saying that sports tapped into the same predatory instincts and this assertion of domination. So you have this trend going on where the science then leads to the application towards man. You also see the evolution of facial hair too here, which I think is kind of important to address. So the application towards society, now what was happening in society during this time? It was industrialism. And industrialism, previously in America, there was much more community-based. It was smaller. Dun & Bradstreet actually had credit ratings on the virtues and the principles of businessmen. However, things started to change during in the Industrial Revolution, and this competition, this struggle for survival, started having application in society between businessmen and consumers, and there's this bifurcation in society between classes. People started to justify what was happening in society with Darwinian beliefs by appealing to nature. This was natural. This was the course of human evolution, was what was going on in industrialism. At the same time, industrialism also started to create a more mechanized society. Everything was designed along order. People became products. Namely, Frederick Winslow Taylor, the father of Taylorism, he coined this later on. He coined scientific management. So the scientific approach to society was then applied towards industry. So you have Darwin's thoughts, you have it applied to man, you have it applied to society, and then you have the society that existed, this competitive society, this cutthroat society. Even Jay Gould, said that Wall Street is like the ocean; it can't be corralled in. This was something that was inevitable, that was over the course of nature. Now, as all this was happening, what was the impact on individual society? You had this crisis of manhood. So during this period, as you had this rise in Darwinian thought, this change in industrial society, there was a redefinition of man. In the Victorian era, the ideal man was the gentleman, literally a gentle man. It was restrained strength. It was conducting oneself along higher principles and a code of honor. However, this competitive society then rendered the ideal man as an individual who was strong, who was superior. You can see right here, this is Teddy Roosevelt, his freshman year at Harvard on the crew team, showing off his buff. Yeah, and Teddy Roosevelt was very much, he was emblematic of this time. He wrote of the strenuous life. He said that success does not come to one who wishes for peace, it is one who does not shy away from danger. And that is the one who achieves triumph. So you see much of this rhetoric of competition, strength, superiority. This then had application in the physical sense as well. Suddenly, during the Victorian era, the gentleman was the tall, lean, reserved individual. Now, the ideal male body type was the strong man. It was the one who exhibited strength. It was the boxer. So there was this change in identity. There was this change in authority, because at the time there was not only industrialism happening, that also then changed the relationship between men and women. Women started gaining more power in the workforce, and there was a sense that men had to kind of assert the strength. And there was a change in the physical nature as well. So this was all prevalent in society. However, it started to permeate the universities. So, as I mentioned, the Civil War was a major turning point. And before the Civil War, universities were mostly based on moral education. It was about creating principled men of God. It was about enhancing the soul. The Civil War started to change things. One, the Industrial Revolution happened right after, and then suddenly the universities became less focused on creating the scholars, creating the monks, and instead, we were going to create the leaders of society. We were going to create these strong men. We were going to create these individuals who were going to be leading us into the future. And there was this emphasis on the physical, the physical nature of these men as well. The Morrill Land Grant Act of 1862, which during the Civil War, it gave plenty of money to found new universities. But one of the prerequisites is that they had military drills and gymnastics. But suddenly, to create these leaders in the future, you also had to make them fit. You had to make them competitive. And this allowed for the fertile grounds for football to grow. Now, football itself had existed in many different forms over history. there was this medieval mob ball that was just a complete brawl out in the field. And then even in the 1820s, Harvard had their Bloody Monday, which was a ball game match between the freshman and sophomore classes. That was just kind of it was called Bloody Monday for a reason. And there's a reason why football in America and football in other parts of the world are called football, because it was a ball game. There weren't really defined rules. We're trying to get from one place to another with a ball. However, as this ball game began to become prevalent on these college campuses, they started to become much more a unified identity. This was an American game. The first football game intercollegiate football game was played between Princeton and Rutgers in 1869, and the whole thing was a complete Donnybrook. I mean, there was no sense of order or whatever, but you had a school competing against another school in an athletic competition. And while rowing did exist prior, this was a physical contact type of competition. So all this is happening, and suddenly, in 1891, a new school emerges on the West Coast. That's Stanford right here. So Leland Stanford, the founder of Stanford, very much embodied the industrial era. He himself was a railroad baron. A little bit of questionable business practices, but he was adhering to the ideology of the nature of the time, which was do whatever it takes and compete. But he, as soon as his son died, as we know, his son died of typhoid, and when they were on a trip over to Europe, he kind of changed his view a little bit and wanted to found a school that was for the children of California. But his vision for the school was not necessarily the traditional Oxford-Cambridge model of trying to create these scholars, trying to create these, it was in a classical education. Instead, he said that he wanted to create a school that would prepare people, that would be in spirit of the progressive future. They would be the ones, it would be the strong men to lead us into the future. And Stanford would be co-ed. However, he had said that that the women would be the mothers of the future generations. But he had very much of this forward-looking vision that was based on usefulness. The founding grant says that Stanford would prepare the students for usefulness in life. So they were approaching different presidents, and Andrew White of Cornell said he couldn't be a president, but he had a guy in mind who was a member of the Cornell pioneer class himself, and that's David Starr Jordan. So David Starr Jordan is unique, and he's particularly relevant to this project because, one, he was an ichthyologist by training, which is the study of fish. So he had very much of an evolutionary Darwin mindset. He wrote a lot about Darwin, and he even wrote a piece called The Evolution of the College Curriculum, where he talked about the old schools dying off and the new schools prevailing, where you had the survival of the fittest, he literally called, between universities. And what was going to be the fittest university? It was going to be the new university that he described being hallowed by no traditions and hampered by none, with all final posts pointing forward into the future. So he saw this as an opportunity. Now he was going to be able to implement his vision of a university at Stanford. Because Leland and Jane Stanford weren't educated. They had this vision, they wanted to create a university. However, they were going to give David Starr Jordan the wheel. And while he was at Indiana University prior to Stanford, he just started to, he was very much in line with Leland's vision, where he departed from the classical education and was focused on the German model of education. He was hired by a German at Indiana University, and he even went over to Europe and studied and learned with a lot of the different German universities, which was based on practical education. It was a major focus. It wasn't as much about this holistic education. It was based on use. It was based on focus. It was based very much on preparing people for this new competitive society. So when he got to Stanford, David Starr Jordan, one of the unique things is when Stanford first opened, or before it opened, there was a plan in place that it was going to be the first school in California to have physical education as a major. And it was one of the first schools in the whole nation to have physical education as a major. David Starr Jordan, not only, this part of the practical education was also being fit. And the physical education, a lot of the students would come in, they would actually conduct physical tests, and then they would tailor specific programs for the students, and they'd have to learn about physical exercise and the training regimen that goes into it. Now, one thing he also brought when he started at Stanford, he started this at Indiana University, that he brought this at Stanford, was a student-faculty baseball game. He was a big believer in sports. In this picture right here, this is in the first student-faculty baseball game, which was 1891. As I mentioned before, the school opened in October 1st of 1891, so we're within a couple months of it founding, he already wanted to have the student-faculty baseball games. And the students even joked that a prerequisite to becoming a professor at Stanford was to have been a former athlete. So there was even a play that they put on where David Starr Jordan dismissed class because he heard there was a baseball game going on in the field. So there was this infrastructure set in place for athletics to give rise to athletics. Stanford even allocated 13 acres for athletic fields prior to its opening. However, when it opened, this was all for intramural purposes. This was all for physical fitness. What would happen is that there would be a challenge across the bay. So, as I mentioned, University of California, Berkeley challenged Stanford to a football game within weeks of it opening its doors. Berkeley had a football team, and they mostly played against club teams. There's no other school in the Bay that had a football team. It was mostly against clubs. The Olympic Club was one of their rivals at the time, I guess you could say, which is kind of funny to think about now. But they saw there was a new university, and they wanted to assert their dominance as the football school in the Bay. So Stanford got this challenge, and being very much embodying the competitive spirit of this era, of course they were going to accept the challenge, and they were going to prove themselves worthy. However, they didn't have a football team. They had the infrastructure for it. There was very much this physical mindset. There were these fields, but they had to figure out how they were going to make this all happen. So they had a meeting in Encina Gymnasium, and they approached John G. Whitmore. So John G. Whitmore, what made him special? Well, he was actually a senior transfer from University of Washington in St. Louis. And while he was at University of Washington, St. Louis, he played football. So he had experience playing football prior. So the students, of course, were like, all right, this is our guy. He's going to teach us how to play football. He's going to coach us up. So he became he became the captain of the team. He became the coach of the team. And, interestingly enough, the student body elected him student body president. So not only was he going to be the leader of the football team, but he was going to be the leader of all the culture of the school. And he took this responsibility seriously. He came up with the first chant for Stanford, which went, rah, 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 Stanford, Stanford, Stanford. Which I think he got a little bit more spirit in it, but yeah, it wasn't exactly the most original chant. But you know, it was something that the students could all learn, and that and there would be and the fan base would be involved in the football game. He recognized this is really important for student culture. So he was managing all this, and he had to find an assistant because he couldn't do this all on his own. So he recruited a precocious freshman named Herbert Hoover to be the student manager of the team. Now Herbert Hoover didn't actually have much of a formal high school education, but he had a lot of training in bookkeeping, so he was the perfect guy for this task. So they had some practices, and Herbert Hoover, being the innovator that he was, as we learned in the previous lecture, he decided to sell tickets to these practices. Okay, we can make some money. So they made some money. They were able to buy themselves uniforms. They were able to get funding for travel for the game against Berkeley. And the game was set. It was going to be played on March 17th, 1892 at the Haight Street Fairgrounds, or at the Haight Street grounds in San Francisco, where Keyser Stadium now is. So the game came around, and at that time they had stands for about 12 to 15,000 people, and over 20,000 people showed up. So the place was completely overwhelmed. Herbert Hoover actually ended up missing the game because he was too busy counting all. They ran out of tickets, and he had to get hard cash. And these two schools ended up raising $30,000, which in today's terms is over $1 million in this one game. So Stanford was out there, and the two teams met in the middle, and they were ready to kick off. But there was one issue: there wasn't a ball. So fortunately, there was a proprietor of a sporting goods store in the stands, and he got on horseback and drove for an hour and got the ball and came back. And the ball was actually more of like, it was a football and a boxing bag kind of put together. It was stuffed. It was a stuffed football, but it was something that they could play this crazy game with. So Whitmore was savvy. He knew that they were a smaller team. They were less experienced, so he had all this trickery. And the trickery paid off. Stanford ended up winning the first big game. And this had a resounding impact on the school. I mean, the students went to the Bush Street Theater afterwards, and there's chronicle articles about how it sounded like a freight train, how loud they were. And Lucy Allback, a member of the Pioneer class, wrote back to home about how this was such a tremendous experience unifying the culture, and how she wishes that all her friends back home could have experienced this as well. So they won the game. The culture, there was this very spirited culture based on football now. But how were they going to sustain? As I mentioned, John G. Whitmore, he was a senior. Like, he was leaving. And they had to figure out a way to continue this success. So he penned a letter to none other than the father of American football, Walter Camp. And Walter Camp got back to him and said, if you can't find a coach by November, I'll come and I'll coach you guys after the Yale season. And they couldn't find another coach, and he came by. So Walter Camp, as I mentioned, he's the father of American football. And he was a player at Yale and a coach at Yale. Now, his experience of football started before he even got to Yale. He was a high school student in New Haven his senior year, and he attended the Harvard-Yale football game. As I mentioned at the time, football was it was a sport that it was very ambiguous rules. And Harvard showed up to the game, and they said, you know what, we're going to carry the ball. Which at the time, Yale was playing more of I could call it street soccer, a very physical version of soccer. And all of a sudden, Camp, as a high school student, noticed, like, oh, you can be innovative in this sport. You can develop this sport. You can create a new way of playing the sport. So when he was playing at Yale, he then applied that mindset to his playing style. And then he essentially became the coach, because they didn't have a coach. His teammates said that he wasn't a natural born leader, but he wasn't just a natural born leader, he was the undisputed leader. And he built this training regimen for his teammates. Teddy Roosevelt even commented at the 1876 Harvard-Yale game about the way by which Walter Camp played. Teddy Roosevelt, he couldn't play football because of his eyesight, so that's why he resorted to rowing and boxing instead. But Walter Camp, he took a major interest in developing players. So he realized that the important role of a coach is also to develop these players into becoming better players. So one of his proteges was none other than Frederick Remington, the Western artist. And Frederick Remington later would comment that the impact that football had on his life, and how football, for the people who couldn't make it to the West, was the way to create that same kind of toughness, that same kind of vigor that one would have exploring the West. So Walter Camp, he coached at Yale. He played at Yale, and he started coaching, and then he went to medical school and got typhoid fever and wasn't able to continue medical school. So then he got a job at the New Haven Clock Company. So now this guy who was enamored with innovation was in a center of industry. He was mostly on the sales side, but then he worked up the ranks eventually to become more on the managerial side. And he actually built an assembly line of clockmaking. So, as mentioned before, this Taylorism idea, the mechanization of production for efficiency's sake, he was now immersed in that, and he started applying that to football. So he was in the same year that Stanford was founded. He literally wrote the book on football, American Football by Walter Camp. And in this book, he tried to standardize a set of rules. So football, as I mentioned, it was this game built on strength, this very manly type of game, but it was chaos. And he tried to install a certain structure to it, a certain rhythm. So certain changes he made, certain proposals he made. He wanted to standardize this across the country. So he invented the idea of having downs. where there would be the way that he originally envisioned it is that you would have 3 downs to gain 5 yards. So suddenly there was a start and stop to the game, and because there was a clock, there was not only a start and stop to the game, there was a start and stop to the clock. So suddenly time became an important feature to the game. Now who would control the time? Well, the players couldn't really do it, so then it had to be the coach on the sideline. So then the coach would then have to communicate to the players. Well, how would he do that? Well, he would come up with signals. And that's where the quarterback is really called the signal caller, because the quarterback, the coach comes up with these plays and instructions, and the quarterback communicates it to the team. So it became very military in style. It was like the coaches were the generals on the field. Additionally, Camp also instituted formations. There would be a certain shape and form in the way that things would operate most efficiently. But most importantly, he invented positions. Every people would have designated roles, but those designated roles would also be based on body types. So it famously one of the leading players on the Stanford football team who scored the first touchdown in the first big game was moved from halfback to guard. Not because he couldn't score touchdowns, because no, you're a bigger guy, you're going to be a guard, because that's where you're designated to be. So similar to Jordan, he came to Stanford seeing this as an opportunity. He wanted to proselytize football. He wanted to expand football, and not only football itself, also his vision for football of how it should be to the West Coast. And Stanford was fertile ground for that. So he got to Stanford, and interesting enough, Stanford hired him. And then Berkeley, in turn, hired Lee Bum McClung, who was his captain of the Yale team, saying, all right, you're going to hire their coach, we're going to hire your captains, that way you don't have a competitive advantage. Interesting enough, Bum McClung ended up being Secretary of the Treasury later. So you say the football career was short-lived, but maybe for good reason. But So Camp got to Stanford, and he gave a famous lecture in the chapel. And in this lecture, he talked a lot about the atavistic origins of football. And he continued to talk about football versus rugby. And the way he distinguished football and rugby was very much of the rules. Rugby, he said, was emblematic of the English, in many ways it was emblematic of English common law. There was tradition to it. In rugby, in the try, which is like the touchdown, you set the ball down, you wait for it to stop. A lot of it is up to discretion. Now, football, like America, was much more statutory law. It was much more of rules. It was everything was delineated, and that's the way the game was conducted. So he immediately got with the team, and he started, as I mentioned, he started moving around the players to different positions. He said, you're going to be here, you're going to be there. He came up with strict regimented practice based on time. Once again, controlling the clock, controlling time. And he realized that this was a lean team. So what we're going to do, we're going to change your entire diet. We're going to get the farmers from Palo Alto. We're going to get you beef and mutton, and we're going to have you're going to eat differently than other people because you need to be prepared for this game. So they had their practices, and he installed his system, and then they had their game. So the game was once again, it was actually the same year as the first big game. So it was 1892, but this time it was in December 17th. And interesting enough, they got to the game, and what did Walter Camp do? He said, I'm going to be the referee. And Bum McClung did the same thing. He said, I'm going to be a referee. Because this game wasn't really about Stanford versus Berkeley. It was about the sport. It was about football. And he wanted to make sure that his vision of football was executed out in the field. So the game actually resulted in a tie. But the person who really won was Walter Camp. Because he successfully implemented his system of football on the West Coast. And while he was at Stanford, his son also came by, and his son Walter Camp Jr. ended up becoming the first Stanford mascot. Interestingly enough, so and here's an example of the ways by which he tried to diagram the field. There was dimensions to it. Suddenly, this broad field was given certain structure. You can see designated positions there, and the field markers. This was all new. Like, this looks like a normal football field now. This is something we're familiar with. This did not exist beforehand. So Walter Camp is truly like the father of American football, and Stanford got to have him in the first year of its existence. So The next year, Kent went back to the East Coast, and then he recruited Pop Bliss, one of his former players, to coach the team. So he wanted to continue that Yale legacy. He wanted to make sure that his system was in place. And Berkeley did the same thing. They hired Pudge Heffinger to coach their team, who was also a Yaley. And the two teams, Stanford had a pretty good season. They went undefeated. They went undefeated with one tie, and then they ended up beating Berkeley in the big game again. But then he left. Pop Bliss left. So then Camp decided, I'm going to come back, and I'm going to, because he realized that Stanford, one, had a lot of young players, because a lot of those other players were getting old. So he wanted to make sure his system sustained. But two, he had another trick up his sleeve. He said, we're going to host the first intersectional game out here on the West Coast. So he communicated with Alonzo Stagg of the University of Chicago, and the University of Chicago came out to California and played 2 games against Stanford. So suddenly, Stanford was the team on the West Coast. When the East Coast team came out to the West Coast, who did they play against? It was Stanford. Stanford was that football team. A few years later, Stanford was invited to participate in the first Rose Bowl. So once again, they were the representative. They played against University of Michigan, and they got bad. They got beaten badly. And interesting enough, the game once again was overflowed with fans, and they ended up actually banning football at the Rose Bowl. And went to chariot games until 1916 because they couldn't handle the fans and the chaos. But Stanford sustained a lot of success. They continued on this track. They went from hiring Yale coaches to Stanford coaches, and they got John Lanigan in 1903. And in 1905, they had a completely undefeated season, one of the greatest seasons in Stanford history, they said, one of the greatest wins in big game history. But another thing happened in 1905. So in 1905, the Chicago Tribune published nationwide about the amount of deaths that were happening in football. People were aware of this, but this one really became publicized. So 19 players across the country died playing football. As I mentioned, football, even with Walter Camp's rules, it was still a very different game at the time. And there was also a lack of refereeing. That's why you can't want to be a referee. You want to have the structure. There's a lack of refereeing. So even if there were rules, people didn't really play by them. So 19 deaths happened, and then one of those deaths was a player, high school player at Santa Clara. So this kind of hit close to home. And David Starr Jordan, we'll return to, he became one of the proponents for abolishing football, saying that football was too deadly of a sport. At the same time, he also criticized Camp because he thought that football became too professional. Football shouldn't be this professional game. It should be a right to passage to becoming a man. And it should be contained in the university. It should be a physical contest. So what is his alternative? His alternative was rugby. Rugby. He studied. He did some research down in Australia previously, and he studied the game of rugby. And rugby, in many ways, was and perhaps still is a bit safer than football. Rugby's a slower game. It's much more spread out. People are along a line, and there isn't this start and stop. There isn't necessarily these high-speed collisions. And David Starr Jordan saw it as much more of a sport that it didn't have this sense of professionalism to it. It didn't necessarily have the interference of the coaches. So the Stanford rugby team actually did pretty well. They had a bunch of successful seasons. They ended up going into 90, 97, and 14 over from 1906 until 1919. So it was a good record. But the issue is the fans never really bought into it. The first big game they had, with the San Francisco Chronicle said, rugby a great disappointment, and other people commented on how rugby was as exciting as watching sheep getting herded into a pen. So the fan base was out on rugby, and other factors happened. The World War I occurred, and suddenly there was a stoppage of a lot of collegiate sports. And then many of these students and many of these football players and rugby players were at these training camps. And what was the game that they were going to play at the training camps? Were they going to play rugby no, they're going to play football because football was the American game. And other schools across the country hadn't really bought into the whole rugby promotion either. There was also the traditions that, especially at Stanford, had were all founded on football. So the Psalm books right here, football was the impetus for a lot of these traditions. In 1916, there was a fallout between Stanford and Berkeley, and Berkeley said, you know what, we're going to go back to football. And Stanford ended up playing a big game against Santa Clara in rugby, but you kind of lost that rivalry. And as World War I, as the soldiers returned from World War I, there was this new vigor for football. And at the same time, too, football had changed. In 1906, right after this massive report, Teddy Roosevelt got with John Heisman, the guy of the Heisman Trophy, and they legalized the forward pass. So that changed the game, because during Camp's time, there was no legalization of the forward pass. And they also created the NCAA as a central governing authority for football to make sure everything was played safely and according to certain rules. So Stanford returned from World War I, and football became the game again. However, they were behind. They hadn't played football since 1905, and they hired a couple coaches. They had this one coach, Bob Evans, who was coaching basketball, baseball, and football, and was notorious for getting in fights with referees and with fans in the stands. I mean, the whole thing was a mess. And eventually, there was this board of athletic controllers, which was kind of the predecessor to the athletic department. And they got together and said, all right, we need to get a coach again who's going to be here for a long term and really change things. So they went from having one of the most legendary, probably the most legendary coach of all time, to the second most legendary coach of all time, Pop Warner. At this time, Pop Warner, similar to Camp, was already a household name. And they approached him, and he was famous. He coached the Carlisle Indian School to become this football powerhouse with Jim Thorpe famously there. And he also coached at Georgia. At the time, he was coaching at Pitt. So they approached him. He was still under contract at Pitt, so then he sent some emissaries. And they started to install the Warner system. So now Stanford was going to get up to speed with this new standard of college football. As soon as Warner got there, what they started to do is they had double wing formations. They started having he invented the bootleg the bootleg concept that we see a lot now in football. He developed screen passes. He developed the down game field of football that Stanford just didn't have. And suddenly they had it. And he was a trickster. He was very deceptive. So in 1924, he had his first season at Stanford. And Stanford made it to the Rose Bowl. And they played, there was this famous game of Pop Warner against Newt Rockne, of Stanford versus Notre Dame. And Stanford ended up winning. Stanford ended up coming up short, but ended up winning a few years later. And they had a lot of sustained success. Warner was there until 1932, and while he was at Stanford, he wrote a book, similar to Camp, on football for coaches and players that tried to standardize these new rules. And Stanford was the place where everything was becoming standardized. So he saw this as an opportunity to build a football empire, and that he did. And then he left in 1932 to try to build another football empire at Temple. And he left one of his assistants, Tiny Thornhill was his name, great football name, to be the coach. And Stanford has sustained success. And there was a stoppage of football in World War II, but everyone stopped during World War II, and Stanford continued on this tradition. So as we look back, and David Starr Jordan commented that Stanford was a school hallowed by no traditions, hampered by none, and all its finer posts pointing forward to the future. Right at its inception, it created its own tradition in the competitive game of football. Football, in many ways, embodied this physicality, embodied this Darwinian thought, competition, embodied this manliness, embodied the order of the Industrial Revolution. And this all happened at Stanford at its founding. Now, Stanford now is known for a lot more things than football. It's accomplished a lot of great things, and it has a lot of fame. However, we can't forget there was Jordan Schoolboys, the famous name that they gave themselves when they first played against Berkeley. Jordan Schoolboys. It was they who gave this esteemed university its first reputation. So I want us all to take a step back and we think about what's happening now. So we have transfer portal, we have NIL, that's going on in football. At the same time, there's rapid industrial change. And there's also a crisis of manhood. So the question I'd like to leave you is, how's Stanford going to answer this question? Thank you.